So the document we're going to review here is one of the most important, obviously, in a real estate transaction. It is the Standard Agreement of Sale. It's abbreviated here as ASR. That's the document abbreviation, but you might hear it, myself or a realtor refer to it as an AOS as well. So the point of this video, we're going to try to get through as much of this as possible really quick. Obviously, you're going to have more questions. Happy to go ahead and answer those and really step through this more. Really high level on this video. Again, the document as a whole is 11 pages, nearly 1,000 lines of legal jargon. So the goal here is to try to quickly simplify that for you. First page is pretty straightforward. Hopefully we're only submitting one offer for you in the event that we are submitting multiple. A lot of these things won't change. So the buyer information, my information as the licensee down here in the middle of the page, none of that will change. Obviously, we will fill out the property address each time we go ahead here and put through an offer. We will fill in the licensee on the sale side of the transaction. Page 2 is where we really get into the details. The first line is going to be the date we are making the offer today. Line 4 is going to be the price we are simply purchasing the property for. This will be written out in text. The next few lines establish a timeline for a deposit. So it's commonplace in the industry to submit that initial, what we call an earnest money deposit, within 5 days of going under contract. And so we'll talk about what earnest money is and more specifically how to track the dates in a contract from a timeline perspective in a separate video. I don't want to get caught up in that today. Again, sometimes there's a second deposit due. Not necessarily super common. It depends on the type of transaction. Some new constructions, that's very common. Deposits and multiple of that in that case. The deposit, unless otherwise noted, is always held by the listing broker. So that is going to be a check or a wire that we'll get that information when we're putting this together, but that will be held by the listing broker until settlement, at which point that deposit will be credited towards your total cash required to close for the property. So if that would be different for one reason or another, that would go here. Seller's assist, we might have talked about this previously. Again, there's going to be a separate video for this as well. In short, if there was seller's assist for the property, that would go here on line 23. Again, those are lender credits, right? So as long as the number that the seller is netting is still what they're looking for, they might not have much of an issue with you taking lender credits, but we can talk through that a little bit more. Another really big data point that a lot of people want to know where it's at in the contract is the settlement date. So when are you taking possession of the property? When are you scheduling your closing for? This date will always have to be on a business day, right? It has to be when the banks are open to cut the final mortgage check to title. Okay, down here's another one I want to call out. This is the deadline for when the offer will expire. Pretty commonplace for it to be 24 hours. So when we send the offer over, typically you give them till the end of the following business day to respond. At that point, the offer is technically expired. If they take longer to review, accept, deny, whatever, we will likely have to change this date and initial the change. Also at the bottom of each page, just realized it now that we didn't touch on it earlier, is you will initial each of these. Zoning classification of the property, that's pulled from public record. The fixtures and personal properties is also, as always, a really important one. Just you want to make sure you're reviewing this with your agent, make sure nothing is assumed. Again, anything attached to the property is expected to remain. So that is a given, but there are some other things that you always want to ask about. If there's a chandelier, things that might be misinterpreted on the other side, you want to make sure we're talking through those when we're putting that offer in. The inclusion sections is another big one, especially with doing new construction here in the city, we want to make sure that not only are we checking what was listed as included on the MLS, typically it's your appliances, your washer dryers, things of that nature, but we want to make sure we're explicitly writing that in here. It's not too, it's not very, it's not uncommon in some of these newer constructions to walk through and, maybe the washer dryer is not hooked up. And so it's sometimes the washer dryer hasn't been delivered yet and that's coming. Other times it's simply not included. So that's a really important one. Moving down a little bit further, the mortgage contingency section is a very significant part of this document as well. For the most part, we're always going to be electing this unless it is a cash offer. In that case, you can waive the mortgage contingency. Simply put, what this says is you are not going to purchase this property unless you get approved for a mortgage, right? Which is why the pre-approval is so important on the front end. It's also why a lot of sellers would like to take a look at the BFI. You can also get a little more granular on what specific terms you would like to be evaluated on, right? So you might say, depending on the volatile interest rate of the market right now, you might not be willing to buy this house if your interest rate is not what maybe it was initially quoted at or within some sort of standard deviation of that rate, right? So let's say you got pre-approved at 3%, you've been searching for 6 months and what have you, and now the rates are 4.25%. That could drastically impact your payment. So that's something we're going to want to keep a close eye on. We'll make sure that we are writing this in such a way that you're protected. Obviously, we will go through a lot of this in detail. I just want to touch on some of the very big areas of the contract. Page 5 allows us to denote what type of utilities are in the property. In the city, you're always going to have the public sewer and trash. In the suburbs, there could be a situation where there's septic, well, et cetera, et cetera. All right, this is the part I wanted to take some time on. So page 6, starting at line 306, the contingencies, right? So everyone here is in the hyper-competitive market of 2021, how everyone's waiving contingencies and what that looks like. This is the section that you do that exactly. So the next 2 pages goes through what each type of contingency is. It's related around inspections primarily. Basically, whichever option you are opting for is the side of the document you will initial, right? So if you were waiving everything, all of our signatures would be along this right margin. Similarly, if you made it contingent that you had the right to do all of these things, you would initial along this left margin. I think that's a really important distinction too, is the right to do and or get out of the contract because of, right? So just because you elect certain contingencies doesn't mean you have to actually do them, right? So an example of that would be maybe you elect for, the property inspection, which is obviously one of the most common ones. So that is, let's find where that. So the home inspection, sorry, it's the first one. So let's say you opted for that, and for one reason or another, you just decided after the fact that you didn't want to schedule an inspection. You couldn't get a hold of someone, you just didn't want to spend the $500, whatever the case was. You don't have to do it, but this gives you the right to carry out that inspection. The seller has to provide access to the home, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what each of these sections are for. Again, if this is protecting you as the buyer in such a situation where you have the home inspection, they reveal certain information that you are not comfortable with. It could be something as small as, the color of the electrical outlet or the way something is wired, that it maybe isn't wrong, it's just not perfect. This allows you the opportunity to point to that inspection. You don't have to get too detailed. But say, hey, based on the findings of so-and-so, I no longer want to carry off that contract. So if you don't have those contingencies elected, you will not have that protection to get out of the contract. Most in today's market, if you have the ability to get a home inspection, we will always advise it. When there are multiple offer situations, some people are now waiving not only that, but everything else to differentiate themselves. So something to keep in mind there. That's the biggest one a lot of people fight and go back and forth over. Everything else is pretty straightforward. The water and trash, because it is a public utility, you will never elect that because it's not really up for debate. Um, I always recommend electing the property and flood insurance, just giving you the ability to make sure the property is insurable. Here in Philadelphia, radon is not very common, but if you do get a home inspection, that is something they usually include in the service package that you're paying for. Same thing here, property boundaries always are going to waive that, more likely than not here in the city, unless you have reason to believe that a neighbor is encroaching on your property at the time of writing the offer. This is something that is typically something we would waive. Lead-based paint, they do a pretty good job of explaining it here in the contract. Any newer constructions, that's something that's not going to be applicable, but anything that is built before 1978, even if it is a renovation and it feels like new construction, if there is any piece of that existing structure there, we will need to have not only this, you don't have to have it tested, but you at least have to sign the disclosure document separate from this. Again, another big one here, and we'll talk in a separate video about how to track the days of the contract, but what is your amount of time you have to complete any inspections or due diligence that you said above. So I always try to put in 15 days here. It's actually very commonplace to do 10. So this is something I like to try to get accepted just for no other reason than just to allow my buyers to have a little bit more time to figure things out, call different inspectors if they need to, just not feel rushed. But this is something you typically get pushback on, and the seller wants to make sure that things aren't falling through as quickly as possible from the time they go under contract. So expect this to be negotiated back to 10. This explains the titles and surveys. Again, I encourage you to read through that. We'll touch on it a little bit more separately. A lot of this speaks to like who is at fault for terminations, what happens with the money, this, that, and the next. If we are buying in an HOA or a condo community, we will be checking these boxes. Any other single family homes or standalones, you will not be electing those. Again, similar if we are doing the HOA or COA, there is a couple of documents we're going to want to review as part of the due diligence. The seller will have to order what's called a resale package, and that will identify a lot of the things that are important to you as the buyer, like what the balances are of the HOA accounts, who is handling what, minutes of recent meetings, what's covered, what's not, what outside vendors are being used, et cetera, et cetera. Again, there's a lot to go over here. We could spend hours going through this contract, so I definitely recommend we'll go through it more separately offline, but definitely take a moment to page through some of this. One of the most important boxes to make sure is checked every single time we send an agreement, and I have this stock in all my templates, so it will never be forgotten on what I'm sending. Seller is limited to retaining sums paid by buyer, including deposit months, as liquidated damage. This is protecting you as the buyer to limit your liability to the amount of your deposit. So hopefully this never comes into play, right? You're signing a contract or making an offer to purchase a property. You should be following through on all of those commitments. But if for whatever reason you do something that is determined to be breach of contract, this box protects you so that you are not able to be sued above the amount of the deposit, right? So if you're putting $5,000 or $10,000 down as part of that earnest money to be credited at closing, of course, that's money that you never want to lose. But in the event that you did something significantly wrong and the seller wanted to hold you accountable for days on market or whatever the case was, a missed opportunity on their end, this is going to be what is protecting you from doing that. Again, they walk through what mediation looks like and release of funds, very important as well. Hopefully, it never comes to that if we do everything correctly, if we're following our timelines. You should never have to be concerned about release of funds and who's going to be mediating a dispute and this, that, and the next. And that's the majority of it. The last page here just kind of details what else we're including in the offer. So it's very commonplace to include that BFI form and also the buyer estimated closing costs. I have some stock additional terms in my agreement of sales that I like to include in all of my offers. Again, just some simple things that have been helpful over the years. Any contract date that falls on a weekend or holiday, we don't want to assume that it's extended to the next business day, but having this in here allows us to make sure that's covered. For instance, if the 10th day of the inspection period were to land on a Saturday, that quote unquote deadline would then be extended to that following Monday. For new construction, I always have that the builder provides a 1-year builder's warranty. Again, we'll talk about builder's warranty separately, but in short, depending on the builder, they can sometimes be worth the amount as the paper it's written on, right? So that's their promise to you as a consumer to come back and fix little things, punch list items that might not have been finished when you bought the property, et cetera, et cetera. But it's not always, depending on the builder, something they're going to jump at the minute you call. But it's always nice to have in there just in case. Never want to take a tax abatement or just you never want to assume a tax abatement is in place. So we're always going to want to check that. I like to write that in there just so we don't forget, but they also see it front and center. And then I always ask if there's any type of transferable warranties, service contracts, documentation pertaining to appliances, or any work that was completed in the property. I find that helpful if you find something that's wrong and there was a contractor that worked on it previously. You might really appreciate calling someone that's already familiar with the property. A couple areas here are disclosures, just saying that you and I have had conversations about what each of these forms are and that you have reviewed them carefully. So I know that was a longer video than I had thought it was going to be, but I tried to touch on all of the major areas of the agreement of sale that are variable fields and that we will be filling out. Hopefully this was super helpful, at least to get you familiar with the document for starters. As we send this in for each of the properties that we're offering on, we'll make sure that we're not only reviewing these significant fields here, but anything else that you have questions on, we'll go through it line by line if we need to, just to make sure everyone's as comfortable as possible. So that's the agreement of sale. It can be a scary document at a glance, but we try to boil it down to a few simple things to make it easy to understand. If you have any questions, let me know, and we'll go from there. Thanks.